Hi, this is Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. I'm so glad you're here. I really wanted to do a craft for Juneteenth, so I'm going to make a tote bag, and I'm going to make this out of two fabrics. This 8-ounce canvas drop cloth that I've made a lot of crafts out of because it's a lot of material. And I have this black cotton twill. Now I'm also going to end up putting a lining in this bag, and I'm going to use a black ripstop nylon for the lining. To start, I'm just going to cut the fabric for the bag, and I'm basing the size of this bag on another canvas tote bag that I have. So I'm going to cut 2 pieces of the black fabric that are 4 inches by 25 inches, and that's for the handles. And I'm going to cut 2 pieces of the black fabric that are 15 inches by 7 inches. That's for the bottom of the bag. And 2 pieces that are 15 inches by 6 inches, and that's for the top of the bag. And then out of the canvas, I'm cutting 2 pieces that are 15 inches by 13 inches. For the lining, you'll want to cut 2 pieces that are 20 inches by 15 inches. But when I cut the lining, because I have such a large piece of this ripstop nylon, I decided to cut a piece that I could just fold in half instead of cutting 2 pieces, so I didn't need that one seam allowance on either side. So I cut it a little bit smaller. Now I want to transfer an image to the drop cloth part of the front of this tote bag. I'm going to use this photograph of Frederick Douglass from the National Park Service website, but I need to make this into something that I can cut on the Cricut. So what I actually did was brought this into Night Cafe, which is an AI image generator, and used it as a starting image and asked Night Cafe to turn it into a line drawing. I then imported that into Photoshop and did a lot of manipulation of that line drawing there, but I was able to get something that I could cut on the Cricut, and I will upload that to my blog in case you would like to use it. There is a link in the description. But I've also found some images on Etsy. If you don't like this one, you could pay for an image on Etsy and use that. I was inspired by an article in the Washington Post called "The Painful Cutting and Brilliant Letters Black People Wrote to Their Former Enslavers," and I selected some quotes from Frederick Douglass's letter to his former enslaver, in which he states some things that should be facts, but that clearly aren't facts if you've enslaved another human being. But he still apologizes to his former enslaver, saying that he thinks that the man might already know these facts. So it's a very it's a touching, horrifying, and humorous letter. So I've just chosen this small phrase: "We are 2 distinct persons, equal persons. What you are, I am." And you can see here in Cricut Design Space how I want to lay this out. The font that I've chosen is a Google font called I Am Fell, and I love this font. It's my sort of go-to pirate font, but I think it's an old-timey sort of looking font. So that's the one I've chosen. Now what I want to do is cut out this phrase in 3 pieces and make a sort of flag out of it. I'm going to print Frederick Douglass in a black ink, and I'm going to print the different phrases in red and green ink. And I've selected these colors because they're the colors of the Pan-African flag. So I'm going to use infusible ink for this project, although you certainly could use vinyl if you like vinyl. And I purchased this package of infusible ink sheets in different colors on Amazon. The brand is Lucky Godness, and I'm going to choose a red, a green, and a black sheet from this package. And then I just printed this out in Cricut Design Space. Again, I separated it out into 4 different pieces, the image of Frederick Douglass, and then the 3 different pieces of the phrases. And I mirrored everything and then printed it out in the 3 pieces. And then I weeded this. Now, the only trick with weeding the letters is for a letter that has a piece that's inside, like A or R, that isn't attached to the outer stripe. You have to be careful to try to keep that piece in place while you're weeding around it. So that was a little tricky, but that was really the only difficult part of weeding this. And I, in my mind, had a name for those little holes inside the A's while I was weeding. I wonder if you could guess what that name was. So once I had all of my pieces weeded and printed, I cut my phrases so that they were rectangles, but I'm going to try to figure out what width I want them to be. So I'm just going to play with it a little, placing them over each other. And then I'm going to cut them so that they sort of flow around the image of Frederick Douglass. So I did transfer the image of Frederick Douglass once I was pretty sure where I wanted everything to go. And you can see that my transfer wasn't entirely successful. So for the next pieces, I thought I would try a little bit longer. There's a range on the package of temperatures and times for the transfers. But I was never completely successful getting a nice clean transfer. So I probably should have gone up to the top temperature and the top time. I probably should have practiced a little bit more. So once I had Frederick Douglass down, what I ended up doing after cutting my stripes to the width that I wanted was sort of tracing over them with a Sharpie so that I could get an outline of Frederick Douglass on them. And then I trimmed them according to the outline. It's not perfect. I was hoping that I would be able to remove some of the ink from the edges of the stripes. So I was hoping that I could have the stripes look like they were sort of fading away toward the end, and that would soften that edge. And to do that, I tried transferring just the edges with an iron onto a scrap piece of fabric. And while some of the ink did transfer that way, it did not soften the edge at all. So if you've ever done that, if you've ever softened the edge of an infusible ink transfer, I would love to know how you did it. And now the other thing you might have noticed is I did transfer those stripes all the way to the edge of the fabric. So part of that will be in the seam, just because I did want the stripes to go all the way to the edge of the front of the bag. So with those all transferred, now I'm going to sew the bag together. To start, I'm just clipping the bottom pieces and the top pieces to each of the canvas pieces, the front and the back. And obviously right sides together, although this twill, it's not clear to me if it has a right side. Now with the handles, what I'm doing is I'm folding over each of the edges, the short edges, a ½ inch, and ironing that. And then I'm folding the entire handle in half and ironing that. and then opening it back up and folding the edges into the middle and then folding it in half. So you do end up with a handle that's quite thick. It is 4 layers of fabric thick, but it has nice folded edges on both sides. And now I am using heavy duty black thread, and I'm just going to sew those black bottom and top pieces to my canvas pieces with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. With all 4 of those seams done, I am pressing those seams open and pressing the front and the back of the bag. And now I'm going to do some top stitching. I'm going to top stitch 1/4 of an inch from the seams in both the black and the canvas. And I'm still using the heavy duty black thread. And I do not trust myself to sew a visible straight line. So I'm marking a line that is 1/4 inch from the seam on either side with a pencil before I go in and sew those seams. Now for the handles, I tried to sew the first seam of the first handle with my regular presser foot, and that was a disaster. So I switched to a walking foot on my sewing machine, and that worked perfectly. So what I did was sewed a seam, a 1/4 inch seam down each side of each handle. So one on the open side where the 2 folded pieces meet, and then one on the closed side just for symmetry. Remember that we do not have to sew the bottom because we folded that in a 1/2 inch. Now I'm taking the front and the back of the bag and matching up the seams of the black and white pieces. And then I trimmed a little bit. They weren't a perfect match. And you'll notice when you see the finished bag, I did not do a perfect job with these, so the seams don't match in 1 or 2 places. Now, I decided to do a lining that was quite separate from the bag, and I'm only going to attach the lining at the very end. But if you have a different way of sewing a bag like this, where you insert the handles and put the lining pieces on now, and then sew everything together, leaving an opening for turning, that's fine. Do it that way. I wanted to do it this way. I wanted my handles on the outside. I wanted to reinforce the handles. So I decided to do it this way and attach the lining at the end. So what I'm going to do now after trimming that is box the corners for the bottom. So at the bottom, I decided to cut a 2 by 2 inch square out of the bottom right and bottom left. So I just marked that with a pencil and then cut it out. And then I sewed a seam down the right side up to that part that I cut out, across the bottom between the parts that I cut out, and up the left side. Once I had done that, I could box the corner. So basically when you do that, you're going to take that bottom seam and press it against the side seam, and that gives you a straight seam across the top to stitch, and that will give you a nice flat bottom to your bag. So do that on both sides. So with the bag bottom and side sewn, now what I'm going to do is just press down the top a 1/2 inch and sew it around just to keep that seam flat. This won't be seen, it'll be on the inside of the bag. And I'm going to sew up the lining basically the same way I sewed up the bag. I'm going to cut a 2-inch square out of the bottom right of each side of the lining. And then because I don't have to sew one side because it's a single piece of fabric, I'm just going to sew across the bottom and up the other side and then box the corners and stitch those. We leave it as it is, the wrong side out, and I can just push it down into my bag. If you've cut the length of it correctly, then it should reach halfway up the black part of the top of the bag. And now we can fold that down. So we're going to fold the black part at the top of the bag down in half, and it will be over the lining. So now I'm going to sew the top of the bag. I'm going to sew it approximately a 1/2 inch from the top, and then I'm going to sew it again a little more than a 1/2 inch from the bottom. Just going to sew that all the way around, and that should sew the lining into your bag because the lining should be reaching the top of the inside. And then to position the handles on the bag, I just found a position that I thought looked good. So I marked the center of the bag, and then I positioned the handle 4 inches at the center from the center of the bag on either side. And I attached the front and the back handles on. And the way I attached them is I had the bottom of the handle a little bit below the lower seam that we just sewed around the top of the bag. And I'm going to sew a rectangle on that, which goes across the top seam, then down the side seam on the handle, across the bottom seam, and then up the side seam on the handle, and then the 2 diagonals from corner to corner, making an X within that rectangle. Pretty much the standard reinforced sew a handle on thing that you've seen probably many times before. Because I didn't trust myself to sew the diagonals, I drew those on with a pencil. And here's the finished bag. I'm pretty excited about it. I love the image and the quote, and it's a nice, sturdy, lined bag that I'll be able to use to carry my books or papers or anything that I need to carry with a tote bag. I'd love to know what you think of the bag. Please tell me in the comments, and also if you have any tips for me, particularly with the infusible ink. This was my first time doing anything with that. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.